All right. Hey, everyone. Nice to meet you. My name is Ethan Sailors. I lead our solutions engineering team here at OneTrust that focuses on our consent and preference management platform. So I have a lot of experience working with our customers to implement and scale technology solutions, specifically in the space of consent management, which we are now seeing start to roll into new connected devices, including over-the-top devices and CTV devices. For those of you that are not as familiar with this space, OTT and CTV, we're essentially referring to things like Roku's, Apple TVs, smart TVs like LG and Samsung, and the like, which we're seeing become more and more prominent in the privacy space as they become ever more prevalent in the homes of everyday consumers. So a quick agenda of what I'm going to walk through today. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the technology landscape, what we're seeing in terms of changing frameworks in this space, as well as evolving consumer expectations. From there, I'll talk a little bit about how this is done in practice when it comes to actually implementing something like a consent management platform. And then at the end of the presentation, I'll walk through a little bit about who we are and what we do here at OneTrust, and I'll answer some Q&A as well. So let me go ahead and dive in. And first, we'll talk a little bit about why this is such a unique space and why we're seeing more and more need for a CMP, or a consent management provider, when it comes to these connected devices. So let's take a look a little bit at the technology landscape. So historically, when we've thought about the need to implement consent frameworks, it's always been very compliance driven from the standpoint of jurisdictional requirements. I think we're coming up on 3 years now from May 25th, or I guess it's 3 years to the day, May 25th, 2018, when GDPR went into effect, and rolling into that, as well as with the requirements from the e-privacy directive, we saw things like cookie banners popping up all over the web, capturing consent for trackers like cookies, tags, beacons, and pixels. And then with the CCPA, we saw a requirement for an opt-out here in the United States, especially when it came to third-party analytics or transfers of data that may be on your different digital properties. But if you think about the core aspects of those laws, they were not very specific to cookies. I think some of the wording there is things like storing and retrieving data on a terminal device, which we naturally thought of as our desktops or our laptops, the browser. But we then saw movement from there into the mobile space. And now, just as data can be collected in the same way on the web and as on your phone, this type of behavioral analytics is starting to happen more and more in connected TVs or smart TVs. However, what is now changing is that the compounding events are not necessarily driven from compliance law. While the GDPR, CCPA, ever-emerging privacy laws are there, we're now seeing that technology leaders in this space are forcing a change with the way that we interact with end users and possibly collect their data. Google has released things like their additional consent mode, which aligns with frameworks like the IAB, as well as things like restricted data processing modes and their tools that you can deploy into these environments. And they've also said that they will soon end the support for third-party cookies within Google Chrome, which is one of the far and wide most widely used web browsers on the internet. Facebook is releasing technical parameters that you can set, things like their limited data use processing mode, which can be turned on in the case of an opt-out. But one of the major ones that we've seen recently is from Apple. Historically, they have been bringing privacy to the forefront. If you think about Safari ITP, with, again, ending, well, not completely ending, but limiting support for third-party cookies. But now one of the major forces we've seen is Apple iOS 14, or now 14.5, which brings with it new privacy requirements, like requirements for disclosure, or as many people are calling it, the privacy nutrition label, which now needs to go into the App Store, disclosing who you may be providing data to, as well as what type of data that is, but also a requirement to opt in for IDFA. which is the identifier for advertising, or really any persistent ID that may be used to track an individual device to device or app to app. So these are all changing the landscape. And while right now we've seen that this has been, again, web to mobile, the next natural evolution, or at least what we're seeing with the customers that we work with at OneTrust, is that now this is moving into the space of connected devices. Now, additionally, with a changing technology landscape, we also have to think about the way that consumers are now interacting with organizations. Here I have a couple stats that show, the vast majority of internet users, at least here in the US, use more than one device. And I think we can pretty much see that that's applicable across the world as people have more smartphones and smart TVs. 74% of households now have some form of subscription or video or on-demand service, which is becoming ever more obvious as we're seeing things like the streaming wars. It seems like every day there's a new streaming service coming out. But as users are moving to these new video on-demand services, and people are starting to use these smart devices or OTT devices more and more, with that, advertisers and publishers are starting to think more about the ad inventory that can be captured within the TV space. And we've seen projections here that the OTT market itself is expected to double over the next 5 years, reaching almost $100 billion. So there's clearly starting to be some demand here. And as we start to track users in new ways, we can see that there's also a need to make sure we're capturing their consent, honoring their choice, as well as being transparent in the ways that we do so. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about when it gets to the technology landscape is just why this is unique compared to things like mobile or especially web. We think about deploying something like a consent management platform on the web, with the exception of needing to integrate with content management solutions or tag managers. It's all basically the same. We're talking about the same HTML, JavaScript-based web pages. Of course, there's some things that are unique, like Google AMP or single-page applications, which I understand. But essentially, we're talking about the same approach that we can take across all of these different websites, of being able to shut off tags or interact with SSPs and DSPs on the web. Even on mobile, which is more fragmented than web, primarily we see two operating systems, iOS and Android. And then, of course, there's always things like React Native, but it's not quite as disparate. Whereas when we come to OTT and CTV platforms, there is an incredibly varied technical landscape that you all have to consider when you're thinking about implementing solutions to capture something like an opt-out or an opt-in consent. All of what I'm showing on the screen right now all use different back-end operating systems. Roku is different than Apple TV. Apple TV is different than Android TV. Tizen, what's deployed behind Samsung TVs, is its own operating system. Even WebOS, which is HTML-based. So you want to consider all of this when you're starting to implement these processes and work with your development teams, as well as make sure that the solution that you're implementing is flexible enough to be deployed in such a disparate space. Now, that's a bit about the technology landscape. Before I walk through how this is actually implemented, let's take a look at what a common user experience would be if we're actually implementing a CMP within a CTV. Here I have a quick example of an IAB TCF user journey. I know those of you that are on the call are probably very familiar with the IAB, but they have now released technical specifications for actually being able to deploy TCF to, or 2.1 in this case, into a connected TV environment. Now, if I go ahead and walk through this user journey, you'll notice that a lot of these components are very similar. We have things like a consent banner that a user can view, as well as a preference center. And these can also be triggered at different times. In this case, I'll open up an app just called Privacy Settings. And here we see that banner, and I can either accept all or jump in to see a list of partners, here pulling from the IAB vendor list, and I can consent or object to legitimate interest. Very similar, however, there are always going to be some other considerations to make here. For example, moving through this user interface, we're now no longer doing so with something like a touch screen or a cursor. And as you move between purposes, purpose lists, descriptions, vendor lists, you'll want to consider that this is being done with a remote control. And with this, we can look at other solutions as well, like passing this back to a phone or the web so that a user can come and make these choices. The end goal, though, is you're making sure that you're showing everything that they need to effectively understand what data is being processed in the application, as well as set their privacy choices and either give consent or opt out. Okay, so we framed up essentially why this is difficult, talked a little bit about the changing and evolving technical space as well as privacy requirements. Why don't we just take a second step back and talk about how this works in practice when we think about what any type of CMP may be doing within the CTV space. All right, so here I've outlined essentially that same user flow that we just walked through. In this case, I may be a publisher and a consumer can come to an application or really any digital property. And in this case, they will initially be served an ad, or there will be a determination on if that is a personalized ad or just a standard ad that's served. However, as a CMP is running within the application, this is where the user's choice can be collected. And in this case, if we're talking about GDPR, that's where consent would be collected, or you can trigger something like an opt-out. But it's important here that the CMP can actually signal that consent, which in this case, we can use standard frameworks like the IAB, or work with native parameters that are set within a lot of these devices to turn on or off things like targeting or personalization. Now, as that consent is signaled, it's then picked up by the supply side provider and passed to your ad tech vendors and your ad network through your DSP, and ultimately sent back to the actual brands and advertisers themselves. And then from there, they can determine if they're actually going to serve that personalized ad, which then can be delivered back to the consumer. Now, that's the ecosystem that we're working with. However, there's several things that still need to be considered within the space. Number one, are you actually disclosing the right information? What's the copy that you're rendering on that banner? Are you meeting notice and disclosure requirements, which often needs to happen at or before the time of collecting that data? And this is where you can use standard frameworks like the IAB to make sure that that disclosure is appropriate. The other one is, who's actually allowed to receive this data that's collected? This is where you actually want to have clear governance within this process to make sure you're actually propagating that to verified vendors. And then the last one is, do you have consent? And that's the real question to ask, because capturing consent is a bit more than just understanding did someone click a button or not. You need to understand what are the requirements for consent under the jurisdiction that you're operating in. For example, in GDPR, that needs to be unbundled. Informed consent, which again ties back to the disclosure and what you're actually showing to the user before they may click a toggle on or off. Now, the other thing to consider in this space, and I mentioned this a little bit before, is who's actually receiving this data. And that's where having a certified CMP can be a big help, because you're no longer thinking about a disparate list of, who knows, third parties receiving this information. You're working with a certified list of certified vendors, which you can pass that information to. But additionally, on the flip side of that, this is also where we're seeing an uptick in the vendors themselves putting a higher priority on a consented inventory, because now they can actually deliver those personalized ads and make sure that they're hitting their target audience. So this is the ecosystem that we're working in. And this is an area where it's very important on both sides to make sure you verify who you're sending to. But again, from the vendor perspective, they can make sure that they're getting the right information in return. All right, so I know we've got about 10 minutes left. A couple other things to consider here, the actual UI components, and this really comes into that aspect of making sure you're capturing the right consent. Of course, one piece of that is the copy that you're putting on your notice or your disclosure. But then the other components of that are the preference center itself. So where are you actually prompting for an opt-in or an opt-out? What's the text within that? You actually need to have purpose level details. Again, thinking about unbundled informed consent. If I show someone 3 purposes, functional analytics, targeting, am I making sure that I'm delivering the right message to my end user so they can reasonably understand what that means? And then if you're looking at vendor level opt-outs, you need to be able to deliver a vendor list as well as details within this experience. A couple examples of what this may look like, just diving a bit further in. This is an example of a consent banner. And with this, it's also important to make sure that you're delivering the right button set, as we've seen certain requirements out of specific countries. You need to have an accept all and or you have to have a reject all of equal weight and importance as your accept all if you're showing that button. And then you also want to consider your user flow when you're talking about something like a preference center. For example, are you triggering any of these, right before you serve ads? If you're not required to capture consent, do you need to have a banner? Can you just trigger your preference center from the privacy settings of your application? These are all considerations that can be made with the multiple teams that will generally be involved in this process to not just make sure that you're delivering what's necessary for compliance, but also fostering a good user experience and not overwhelming someone with constant prompts about how they may be tracked in the app. Now, I think that's a good segue outside of just standard requirements and kind of what's needed to implement a CMP. Additionally, there's some other considerations you can make that really go along with enhancing your user experience. At the beginning of this, we talked about kind of growing consumer expectations and how a multi-device consumer is the new normal. Well, with OTT specifically, this is a great opportunity to implement things like authenticated consent or cross-device preference management. Commonly, if I'm logging into a TV or accessing a TV, you may have some type of persistent identifier in your application. You can start to use these identifiers to actually sync a user's preference from device to device and start to think about the different personas of individuals that you may actually be interacting with. For example, if I go to a website, I'm an anonymous user, I may be tracked by a cookie. You may then apply a persistent identifier if I log in. All of this can be used for many strategies like first-party data capture, which we're seeing more of a necessity as third-party cookies are going away, but ultimately providing a more unified user experience, which can be very critical. Some examples of what this looks like here, I may have a user that is visiting an application, commonly a streaming app, and in this case, I can sign in and set my settings. If you're tracking a persistent identifier like a user ID or an account, you can then use server-side technology to actually pass this between and actually show that someone's privacy preferences are being synced. Again, really just fostering that idea of trust and transparency, showing a unified user experience and really allowing them to understand that you're going to preserve their privacy choices no matter how they're interacting with your brand. Okay, so we covered a bit of the technical landscape, what some user expectations are, how this needs to work in practice, as well as just some examples of ways you can start to think about this. With any project like this, there's some groundwork that needs to be done. In this case, I consider, what are the specific frameworks or requirements you need to operate under? Are you presenting this to an audience that's in scope for GDPR, CCPA? And then from there, you can start to review these solutions, deploy them, and then ultimately iterate on that to create a better and better user experience. The last thing I'll note before moving into Q&A, as you're looking at these journeys to implement consent management products, OneTrust is the largest provider of privacy technology to our knowledge out there. We were recently given the #1 spot on Inc. 500's fastest growing companies. We have a large backing of investment. We've deployed across 9,000 customers of both large and small organizations, meaning that we've seen many, many different use cases and worked with them to overcome them. And we have an incredibly large in-house expert team, about 40% of which sit in product and R&D. So we're able to quickly iterate on changing privacy frameworks and laws to make sure you're getting the most relevant and needed solutions today. All right, and I think we've got about 5 minutes left, so I can now take some Q&A.
Thank you, Ethan. I've posted a number of questions into the chat box so they're more visible to you. And I think the first one is, what OTT and CTV platforms does OneTrust actually support?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we support a wide array in different ways. The most streamlined deployment that you're going to have is actually using a native SDK for the specific platform. And an SDK, for those that are from a technical background, is a software developer kit. Essentially, it means that we've packaged all of the tools that you need to easily implement it. And we have native SDKs for Apple TV, Android TV, Fire TV, Roku, as well as Tizen, which again is that the operating system for Samsung. We also have an HTML5 based approach, which can be used for things like WebOS or platforms that essentially use cookies. And for anything that we don't have an SDK for, we do have a highly available consent API, so we can deploy that as well. With the SDKs, you get native UI support. We'll actually render the banners and the preference centers for you. With that API, we'll just need to work with your team to develop your user interface. So if there's a platform that I didn't mention, chances are we can still implement. And I'm happy to work with any of you. You can reach out to the OneTrust team and we can blueprint that out.
Thank you, Ethan. And there is actually one other question for you. What challenges do you see organizations face as they expand their CMP past web into mobile and OTT?
Yeah, so a couple points there. One is just the platforms themselves to implement into. Like I mentioned, this is a very disparate space. So a lot of the times folks kind of feel like they're alone in the game. And that's where I think we can really help as a provider that has scaled and built native SDK support across all of these different platforms. The other is thinking about user experience. You know, everyone interacts with these tools differently. Me interacting, you know, with my thumb on a touch screen on a phone is very different than having a cursor on a web. So making sure that whatever you're deploying can be responsive to those screen sizes, especially on OTT where users may need to interact using a remote. And then the last is just understanding, where do I actually need to propagate a consent signal? You know, oftentimes we store this locally. Each one of these has their own local storage locations that we need to pick up consent from, as well as making sure that we're passing that to the downstream vendors, which is where we can, again, leverage